Well, hi everyone. This is session 4, and for today's session, I had asked you to read chapter 5 in the online textbook, Panagua and his stance, and it was all about blended learning. It's a very short chapter, and a lot of the content focuses on flipped classrooms, and it's a very good example. And they were really prominent about 4 or 5 years ago, just when this book was being written, but they do really embody the idea of blended learning. Recording your lecture the night before, having students look at it the night before, and then when they come to class, you can help them doing assignments and activities in the class. And it makes much better use of the instructor's time rather than standing there lecturing when maybe some of the students aren't even listening. The whole idea of flipped classroom and blended learning rests very, very largely on the idea of streamed video. When we talk about technological determinism that I discussed last week, when we really think about all the different applications of things like flipped classroom and other manifestations of blended learning, they do rest on being able to record something, send it out on YouTube or Vimeo, having it streamed in real time like Zoom, or having it stored on a site like YouTube, and students can watch it at their own convenience. So very, very much dependent on technology in that regard. I want to talk today about time and teaching. And it's something that's, when we start to consider learning environments, we really do have to look at the way time is being used in education and the very traditional structures of time. I have a PowerPoint or a slide deck that I'm going to show you and go through. I'm going to talk about efficient learning models and some of the flaws we have about learning. After that, I want to look at self-organized learning and this idea that you can structure learning with learning objects. Actually, it was an idea developed by David Wiley quite a while ago, 15 years ago, but it still has some impact in our schooling today. Mobile classrooms, we don't have to look very far to see what we're doing with mobile classrooms in terms of the way this course is being delivered. And with the COVID crisis, all sorts of courses are being delivered through mobile classrooms or distributed learning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I focused on something called the Horizon Report, which is yearly it comes out. There's usually a version for K-12 and also a version for higher education. And they just talk about technologies that are on the horizon. Blended learning is often included, and there's a site that they put online that's all about blended learning. After that, I just want to go over again the idea of MOOCs, since they were kind of developed by a Canadian, and Stephen Downes, and just some of the ideas we have about MOOCs. I won't have a closing video today. I'll just outline the fact that for next week it will be session 5. The textbook reading will be chapter 6. It is on gamification, which we'll take up next week as well. One other thing, I believe next week on Wednesday, the 17th of February, I'm going to have another optional Zoom session for the class, and I'll answer your questions, and I might go over some questions you might have about your proposals, the concept statements, and things like that. So we'll go right in to the Canvas site and start looking at time and teaching. If we go to Canvas and go to session 4, and I'll just close the hamburger to get rid of the left column, under time and teaching, the first item is a PDF download, and this is an article that was originally published by the United States Department of Education in 1994. Then it was revised and updated in 2005, and that's what this document is. I'm not going to ask you to read the whole document. It's quite interesting, but I have extracted kind of the salient parts of it and put it into a PowerPoint, and that is what this time and teaching link is. It's actually a slide deck. And I'll just go to that, and I'm going to go through it. And there's a lot of really interesting information about traditional learning environments and about expectations for new and progressive kinds of learning environments in this slide deck. So it will start out, just put it on present mode, and time and teaching. And there's kind of an obsession with time in the teaching profession and in education. And again, this is from Prisoners of Time. It's a report from the National Education Commission, 1994-2005. So it just talks about how time is constructed in teaching, and just first part of it, with few exceptions. Schools open and close their doors at fixed times in the morning and early afternoon. With few exceptions, the school year lasts 9 months. This is generalized throughout the United States, but it also pertains to Canada, um, and lots of other countries in the Western world as well. Despite the obsession with time, little attention is paid to how time is used. Only 41% of secondary school time must be spent on core academic subjects. That would be English, math, science. No matter how complex or simple the school subject or how well or poorly students comprehend the material, the schedule assigns each subject an impartial national average of 51 minutes per class period. Now, a lot of this is changing, which the ideas of new learning environments are altering these features of time, but there's still very strong traditions of this in schools. The norm required school days attendance is 180 days, very similar to that in Canada. Schools typically offer a 6-period day with about 5.6 hours of classroom time a day. Works well. That's kind of what happens in the Okanagan and BC in Canada. Staff salary increases are typically tied to time, to seniority and the number of hours of graduate work completed. That's all based on something called the Carnegie Hours. It's how credits are determined at universities and post-secondary institutions. More about school time, just more features of it. Temporal punishment is used extensively, or has been. We punish students with time. We maybe not so much now, but detentions, delays are given to students who don't perform adequately or don't show up. Slow learners, holding back, repeating, accelerating. We use time to reward and punish students, holding them back, making them repeat courses, repeat classes. We can accelerate them. We group students by time by litter, the year of their birth. I spoke with Elliot Eisner once, and I asked him about this at a teachers' convention, and we had a little discussion about that. Just maybe there's better ways of constructing students, and I think some of you might even be looking at that in some of your proposals for this course. Different ways of constructing groups of students. Wasting time. Wasting time. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. This is a quote by St. Benedict, who we're going to talk a little bit more about later on in this slide deck. We have time on task. So we think if you're not on task, you're wasting time. Synchronous and asynchronous learning. Learning in time and learning out of time. It's kind of interesting concepts, as is this concept, learning in real time. What is real time? Well, it's time is constructed in the here and the now. Slow schooling. This was a popular conception, or fairly popular conception a few years ago. It's a backlash against the hamburger approach to education, which emphasized uniformity, predictability, and measurability of processes and results. So there's a whole movement of slow schooling, and just a way to backlash against this kind of progressive, constantly organizing and working with time, and then repurposing of time, which is what chapter 5 was about, was flipping time as in technology and flipped classrooms. So we can repurpose time if we want to. Really interesting concepts of how we're so tied to time. Time is a technology, if you can think of it that way. It's a system regulator. It's systematically applying, regulating the passing of moments with set activities or events, and there's problems associated with that if you're a teacher. Time is used to bring order, method, and uniformity, to regulate one's habits. These are some definitions of technology. We went over them on the first day of class: systematic application of scientific or other organized knowledge to practical tasks. And ed tech is a study of ethical practice of facilitating learning, improving performance by creating, using, managing appropriate technological processes and resources. And in a way, you can kind of think of time as one of those technological processes, of one of our resources. School time, the efficiency of regulated time. So when we look at schools and the history of schools, schools were designed for social efficiency. By using education as an efficiency tool, theorists believe that society could be controlled. It's kind of social engineering. Students would be scientifically evaluated with tests, IQ tests, and educated towards specific roles in society. We see that with streaming, vocational schools. And social efficiency, vocational junior high schools were created to address the curriculum designed around each student's societal future. So when you're 12 or 13, you write some test perhaps, and that through that test it determines what's you're going to be doing for the rest of your life and your career, for your profession. I think students in Britain write the O levels, and that determines which kind of schools they go to. The biggest problem is a preoccupation with an application of the factory model of management to education, where everything's arranged for the scalability and efficiency of the system to which the students, the teachers, the parents, and the administrators have to adjust. Now, this is interesting right here because one historical influence in schooling is the factory, and I'm sure most of you have heard in curriculum courses or in your undergrad programs that schools are based on the factory model, but there is another influence. And I'm sort of interested in this influence, and it is the monastery. I don't have any religious affiliations or anything, but I just find it's really neat to think about how our schools have been partially structured by monastic life, and actually factories were as well. So if we go back, I mentioned we were going to look at Saint Benedict a little bit more closely. He was an Italian monk in the 6th century, and he lived out in he was a hermit and sort of lived out in the desert or in caves. But he came up with this idea that maybe monks should have more of a regulated kind of life and more systematized, more bureaucratic. So he thought of a necessity for a permanent and uniform rule or a set of rules of government in place of arbitrary and variable choices of models. So instead of hermits and monks living out in the desert and having visions and things and not eating properly, he thought, let's kind of institutionalize this whole thing, and we'll live in nice places and eat nice food and make our own wine and bread and be a pretty good situation. So he came up with what's called Benedict's Rule. It's 73 chapters, and they're just statements of 73 different things monks can do to live an orderly life. And it's from this that we get the idea of bells and bells ringing to do certain things at certain times. So he orders the way the monks should sing psalms in churches, when to rise, when to pray, when to work, all based on the ringing of bells. He also showed how a monastery could be governed and how to handle difficult characters. The rule, Benedict's rule, is practical and down to earth. He tells monks how much wine they should drink, how to behave when outside the monastery, and not to wear knives to bed lest they roll over and cut themselves. Whenever I read that, I think, what kind of people were going into monasteries that they needed to be told, don't wear your knife to bed? So if you want to, there's a site here. It'll take you to the rule of Benedict if you want to read each of them in detail. But the whole notion of this is just that we are structured by bells. It's how many schools started out as religious schools, and we still kind of have this aspect of the monastic life, just living in this according to this very highly regulated institution. Now, I'm just changing the subject here, but I want to get into the efficient learning hypothesis, because when you start working with time and you're apportioning time to study this or study that, problems can arise. And this is a hypothesis that comes from George Siemens, who we spoke about last week. The wrong assertion that learners are at roughly the same stage when they start a course and that they progress at roughly the same pace. So you see this a lot in education, where everyone who's 12 years old is in grade 6 or 7. We all assume they have the same background knowledge, the same learning capacities, and then we structure a year's course for them. Well, that creates some problems because there's a flaw. And the flaw is that learning can be doled out by the clock and defined by the calendar. Research confirms that common sense affirms common sense that some students take 3 to 6 times longer than others to learn the same thing. Yet students are caught in a time trap, processed on an assembly line, scheduled to the minute. Our usage of time in this manner virtually assures the failure of many students. So when you structure a course this way with an apportioned time, you're just ensuring, even before the course starts, that some of your students are going to fail because they're not going to learn the material in the time that you've allotted. Interesting. So that's from Prisoners of Time. This is a little case study that I've kind of thought about, and I've thought about it for a long time because I used to teach Logo, and I still teach Logo derivations like Scratch and Tinker. And Logo goes back to the late 70s and early 80s, and I actually taught it at that time. And it came from Seymour Papert's book Mindstorms, and you can look him up. He just passed away 3 or 4 years ago. And we'll talk a little more about Papert as we get into computational thinking. But he used the power of technology and the computer, which he described as a universal medium to provide guided discovery learning to students. So he had this big model of guided discovery learning. Logo was a programming language that he created with a lot of help from people at MIT, and it came from another language called Lisp. But this was the way schools could be structured through guided discovery learning. So he defined constructionism, this working with models, working with computers, in a proposal to the National Science Foundation. And he likened their learning to living in a math land where learning mathematical ideas is as natural as learning French while living in France. That comes from his book, Mindstorms. The problem is when you take guided discovery learning and combine it with traditional school timetable, they really don't go together very well. You're just about to discover something in your, math class, and then the bell goes, and you have to go to phys ed, or you have to go to social studies, or it's lunchtime, or the buses are coming, or there's an assembly. So what happened? Logo started being taught as a way to make students computer literate, but schools didn't adopt the whole idea of guided discovery learning. Logo just fit into one of these periods, from period 3, 1010 to 1057. You could work on computer literacy at that time, and at 1057 the bell went and you went off to the next class, which was entirely different from what you were studying in the class for computer literacy. Papert continued working with his idea of Logo. He came up with Mindstorms NXT, these kind of robotics. He worked with Lego. And later on, some of his students came up with ideas like Scratch and Tinker, and they have a lot of Logo in these new visions of or new versions of visual computer languages or visual language processing. Here's some metaphors to consider. We have regulation in schools, or we can have deregulation. And the idea of adaptive learning and personalized learning, it's kind of more a deregulation kind of situation rather than stop, light, green light. The light's going to stay green for 3 minutes and then you'll have to stop. So it's like you decide where you're going to go, you look out for the things, you determine your own curriculum. That's kind of where we're going with this. And a lot of the new learning environments are more based on deregulation and regulation. Algorithms are flowcharts, and much of what our traditional learning environments are kind of flowchart based. You go from one stage to the next, and you complete things as you go along. You complete grade 8, go to grade 9. A heuristic, it's a Greek word. It's where we get the word eureka from. It's where you discover things, and it's what inquiry based and project based learning and problem based learning is founded upon, is this idea of heuristical learning, where you're inquiring and you're discovering things. And it's sort of the difference between taking courses on the left that are flowcharted and becoming competent at things through discovery or inquiry-based learning. It really breaks the tradition of time. Like you might learn it in 3 weeks, you might learn it in 3 months. So that's one of the issues that happens with personalized learning and adaptive learning, is it's outside of the realm of this structured time. So time's become unhinged from its base. Is another way of thinking of it. Some more considerations. Autodidacticism means learning on your own, learning without someone teaching you. We see that a lot with things on YouTube like the Khan Academy, and students just finding out all sorts of things. And I could ask students in this class, what have you learned in the last month on YouTube? And be a huge range of things, from learning how to play instruments, fixing plumbing in your sink, learning different hairstyles, all sorts of things that people are learning, dance moves, music, all sorts of things that people are learning on YouTube. The idea of deregulated education, so that we're making decisions on our own. We're not basing education on how much time you spend in a class. It's not courses, it's competencies, and that's the new BC curriculum. Personalized learning, I have control over the learning that I want to do. I can set my own curriculum. Adaptive learning is where there might be some computer system that might have some artificial intelligence component in it that's looking at your learning and determining what the next phases of your learning might be. So it's personalized, but the decision is made by maybe a computer or some computerized system that's determining where you should be, what you should be learning next, what you didn't learn properly, and maybe you need to have some revision of that material. And individual education plan, it's sort of like an IEP for everyone. That's kind of how you can think of personalized learning. So that's the slide presentation. It saved you a bit of time from not having to read Prisoners of Time, but it's a very interesting document, and I'd recommend you look at it. If we go back to session 4 and go past time and teaching, this was actually the sufficient learning model information was in the slide deck that I just showed you, so I won't dwell on that. If we move on to self-organized learning environments and learning objects, I just put a link in here. It talks a lot about David Wiley, who came up with this idea of learning objects. I put this in here because you may come across this notion of what a learning object is. They were popular about 10 years ago. They're reusable blocks of instruction, usually held online somewhere. And the idea was that people could make these, store them online in one specific area, and people could extract them and build knowledge or build instructional sequences out of them the same way you might build a model out of Lego pieces. So they're small 5 to 15 minute instructional packages that you can put together, and everyone would use them kind of universally, and that was the idea of them. I just thought it kind of interesting because it is about building your own personalized learning, and just an idea that didn't go all that far. I think in many ways we're still using it. If you go and put things together on YouTube and build your classes that way. So this is some information from David Wiley about those things. Next, the mobile classrooms and online learning. There is a organization called EDUCAUSE. They have some publications. One that they come out with every year and every second year is called the Horizon Report. This is just a resource on all sorts of things about mobile learning and all the articles that have been in some of their publications. I just want to go to one which was on, it is from the Horizon Report 2019. This is actually for higher education, but I'm just going to go and just briefly go through this because they talk about trends that are on the horizon in educational technology. So redesigning learning spaces, blended learning designs, advancing cultures of innovation, growing focus on measuring and learning. And so this article goes into more details about them. So I don't expect you to read all of these. They're just resources that if you're writing your final project or looking for more information about a specific aspect of mobile learning, this might be a good place to go to. And even if you have an opportunity to download some of the Horizon reports from, say, 2 or 3 years ago, there's editions for K to 12, and then there's a higher education edition as well. And finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about MOOCs and George Siemens. And George Siemens is a really interesting educator. He was born on a Mennonite colony in Mexico and then became sort of this advanced intellectual about computer use in society. And I think he worked in Canada for a while, and now he's back. I think he's in New Mexico or Arizona at one of the universities down there. Just an interesting article about a very interesting individual. He was assistant professor at University of Alberta. He worked for the University of Athabasca and Red River College, and came up with this idea of MOOCs, massive online open courses. And you might want to just read a little bit about him as well. So I'm just going to leave this video. Has gone on a little bit longer than I expected today. Just a couple of things before we close, and the reading for next week is chapter 6, which is on games and gamification, and then also on February 17th, which is next Wednesday, or a week from Wednesday, at 4:30, I'll have another optional Zoom session, and people can ask me questions and discuss maybe their projects or their concept statements with me. So that's it for class today. And again, if you have questions, issues, concerns, just email me and I'll get right back to you. Have a good week, and we'll see you in session 5. Thanks so much.